Hello, and welcome to the third discussion of the things they carried. This month, we are talking about some very important stories. We're going to talk about enemies, friends, and how to tell a true war story. Now, how to tell a true war story is what I call a key story. It unlocks a lot of things. We will go in and out of it. And if you've watched the other two videos in this series, as we read through the things they carried this year, you will already probably realize that I refer to how to tell a true war story an awful lot. It is a key. It's absolutely a key in understanding this. But let's start with enemies. We've got enemies and friends, which are about the same two characters, primarily. In enemies, Lee Strunk and Dave Jensen get into a fight over a missing jackknife. Now, remember, enemies and friends comes right at the end of On the Rainy River. We just talked about that last month. On the Rainy River is the one with Birdall and the boat, and whether or not the fictional character of Tim O'Brien is going to sail across the water into Canada and not go to war. And then he decides that he's a coward, so he will go to war. Just remember where we are. Enemies just kind of suddenly picks up. It feels like maybe it picks up randomly, but there's nothing random in this book, not a thing. So the end of On the Rainy River ends with this line on page 58. It says, "The day was cloudy. I passed through towns with familiar names, through the pine forests and down to the prairie, and then to Vietnam, where I was a soldier, and then home again. I survived, but it's not a happy ending. I was a coward. I went to war." And we tie that back to page 33 in Spin, where he says, "I feel guilty sometimes. 43 years old, and I'm still writing war stories. My daughter Kathleen tells me it's an obsession, that I should write about a little girl who finds $1 million and spends it all on a Shetland pony. In a way, I guess she's right. I should forget it, but the thing about remembering is that you don't forget. You take your material where you find it, which is in your life at the intersection of past and present. The memory traffic feeds into a rotary up on your head where it goes in circles for a while, then pretty soon imagination flows in and traffic merges and shoots off down 1,000 different streets. As a writer, all you can do is pick a street and go for the ride, putting things down as they come to you. That's the real obsession." All the stories. Right before that quote on 33, there's a long portion where war is described. And these are all just, imagine just like so many ellipses in this, but I'm just going to consolidate it for you. It says just the definition. So between pages 32 and 33, war is defined this way. The war was nakedly and aggressively boring. The kind of boredom that caused stomach disorders. Dripping inside you like a leaky faucet, it was a sort of acid. You'd try to relax. Well, you'd think this isn't so bad. Right then you'd hear gunfire and you'd be squealing. That kind of boredom. So let's return to enemies and friends. On a morning in late July, while we were out on patrol near LZ Gator, Lee Strunk and Dave Jensen got into a fist fight. It was about something stupid, a missing jackknife. But even so, the fight was vicious. For a while, it went back and forth, but Dave Jensen was much bigger and much stronger, and eventually he wrapped an arm around Strunk's neck and pinned him down and kept hitting him on the nose. He hit him hard, and he didn't stop. Strunk's nose made a sharp snapping sound like a firecracker, but even then, Jensen kept hitting him, over and over again. Quick, stiff punches that did not miss. It took 3 of us to pull him off. When it was over, Strunk had to be choppered back to the rear, where he had his nose looked after, and 2 days later he rejoined us wearing a metal splint and lots of gauze. In any other circumstance, it might have ended there, but this was Vietnam, where guys carried guns. Jensen says Strunk took his jackknife. Strunk says no. They fight. Jensen breaks his nose. Strunk returns from a medic. Jensen lives in fear of retaliation. Jensen breaks under the pressure. Jensen broke his own nose. Jensen breaks his own nose as recompense for Strunk's nose to make things even, because Jensen was right. Strunk had taken his jackknife. I contend that all of this comes about because, as we just read on page 32, the war was nakedly and aggressively boring. The kind of boredom that causes stomach disorders. You try to relax and then you'd hear gunfire and then you'd be squealing. It was that kind of boredom. That kind of boredom. And we're also thinking about that guilt. So on page 33, we read, I feel guilty sometimes, and that guilt makes him obsessive. Absolutely obsessive. We head to page 58, which is the end of On the Rainy River, where he talks about how he decides that he's going to go to Vietnam. It says that he survives, but it's not a happy ending. I was a coward. I went to war. He's dealing with that guilt. And then Enemies is all about that anxiety that drives them to insanity, insane actions, insane escalation of actions. And in reality, there's all these multiple levels of guilt. So once again, this is just a two-page story. It's shorter than a 2-page story. And in it, there's two men, Jensen and Strunk. Jensen accuses Strunk of stealing his jackknife, but it can't be proven. Strunk denies it. They fight, and Jensen breaks Strunk's nose. Strunk returns from medic. Jensen fears retaliation. Jensen breaks under pressure. Jensen breaks his own nose to make up for breaking Strunk's nose, but in the end, the guilt pushes him to break his own nose to just make it even so that he won't be attacked. Did you ever watch How I Met Your Mother? It's like slap bet. It's like Slapsgiving. If you've ever watched that, if you know, you know. If you don't, just ignore the reference. Jensen breaks his own nose, trying to make things even. But the irony is that when Jensen accused Strunk of taking his jackknife and Strunk said no, Strunk was lying. He did take the jackknife. Strunk's nose should have been broken. Jensen's nose never should have been broken, but Jensen breaks his own nose to try and create some kind of equilibrium and save himself from attack. That's Enemies. In Friends, we once again see Dave Jensen and Lee Strunk. Dave Jensen and Lee Strunk did not become instant buddies, but they did learn to trust each other. In the previous story, Strunk lies to Jensen. Jensen accuses him. Strunk lies to him. Jensen breaks both their noses. There's no trust going on here. He breaks his own nose because he doesn't trust him, not to come after him. But they did learn to trust each other. Over the next month, they often teamed up on ambushes. They covered each other on patrol. They shared a foxhole, took turns pulling guard at night. So they do trust each other. In late August, they made a pact. So this was July. Enemies happens in July. By August, like a month later, they make a pact. But remember, Strunk is actually not trustworthy. But here we go. They make a pact that if one of them should ever get totally effed up, a wheelchair wound, the other guy would automatically find a way to end it. As far as I could tell, they were serious. They drew it up on paper, signing their names and asking a couple of guys to act as witnesses. And then in October, Lee Strunk stepped on a rigged mortar round. It took off his right leg at the knee. He managed a funny little half step, like a hop. Then he tilted sideways and dropped. Oh, damn, he said. For a while, he kept on saying it. Damn. Oh, damn. As if he'd stubbed a toe. and then he panicked. He tried to get up and run, but there was nothing left to run on. He fell hard. The stump of his right leg was twitching. There were slivers of bone, and the blood came in quick spurts like water from a pump. He seemed bewildered. He reached down as if to massage his missing leg, and then he passed out, and Rat Kiley put on a tourniquet and administered morphine and ran plasma into him. Okay, so you've got Jensen and Strunk, and they have come to an agreement that if one or the other of them has a wound so severe it would leave them in a wheelchair for the rest of their lives, the other will kill them. And now Strunk has just stepped on mine, lost his leg. He's going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Orthopedics were not what they are now. Let's go back to enemies. So Jensen accuses Strunk of taking his jackknife, which Strunk has done. Strunk denies it. Jensen breaks Strunk's nose. Jensen lives in fear of Strunk retaliating against him, but in reality, so to the point where Jensen breaks his own nose, but in reality, Strunk did take the knife. Now they're friends, and Jensen has promised Strunk, hey, if you get a serious injury, I will kill you. And Strunk has promised Jensen, hey, if you get a serious injury, I will kill you, rather than have you live out your life. They've signed papers, they have witnesses, and now Strunk has gotten a serious injury. And Dave Jensen goes to his side, and Strunk says, man, don't kill me. Relax, Jensen says. Strunk is groggy and confused. Really, it's not so bad, not terrible. Hey, really, they can sew it back on, really. Strunk frowned at the sky. He passed out again, then woke up. Don't kill me. I won't, Jensen says. I'm serious. Sure. But you gotta promise, swear it to me. Swear you won't kill me. I swear. Jensen nodded and said, I swear. And then a little later, we carried Strunk to the dust-off chopper. Jensen reached out and touched the good leg. Get on now, he said. Later, we heard that Strunk died somewhere over Chulai, which seemed to relieve Dave Jensen of an enormous weight. The weight of not following through on the promise. Fate stepped in. He wasn't a proper friend. He had promised that he would do this thing, and then he didn't do it. He was a coward. He felt the guilt. He carried the guilt of not keeping his promise. Jensen was reliable. Strunk was not. You become obsessed with the stories. You've got to tell the stories. The stories have to come out. These are two war stories. Are they true war stories? All the things we've read thus far, are they true? Who is the reliable storyteller? Is the one telling us this story, these stories, a reliable narrator? Are they trustworthy? You following me here? I certainly hope so. We get to how to tell a true war story, our third and final story of the month. And it starts with the phrase, this is true. I had a buddy in Vietnam. His name was Bob Kiley, but everybody called him Rat. A friend of his gets killed, so about a week later, Rat sits down and writes a letter to the guy's sister. Rat tells her what a great brother she had, how together the guy was, a #1 pal and comrade, a real soldier, Rat says. Anyway, it's a terrific letter, very personal and touching. Rat almost bawls writing it. He gets all teary, telling about the good times they had together, how her brother made the war seem almost fun. A great sense of humor, too, like the time at this river. Remember rivers, remember water. Like the time at this river when he went fishing with a whole damn crate of hand grenades. Probably the funniest thing in world history, Rat says. All that gore, about 20 zillion dead fish. What's a bunch of fish? All around you, men are dying. And then the letter gets very sad and serious. Rat pours his heart out. He says he loved the guy. He says the guy was his best friend in the world. They were like soulmates, he says, like twins or something. They had a whole lot in common. He tells the guy's sister he'll look her up when the war's over. So what happens? He mails the letter. He waits 2 months. She never writes back. And then it switches gears and it gives you a little lesson. The story, how to tell a true war story, the story gives you a little lesson. It says, a true war story is never moral. It does not instruct, nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or if you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you have been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie. There is no rectitude whatsoever. There is no virtue. As a first rule of thumb, therefore, you can tell a true war story by its absolute and uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil. Are friends our enemies? Are they true war stories? Is there a moral? I take you back. I take you back. A true war story. There is never a moral. Let's go all the way back to the things they carried. Our first story, and the titular story of the whole shebang here. Let's go back to page 13. Henry Dobbs asked what the moral was. Moral? You know, moral. Sanders wrapped the thumb in toilet paper and handed it across to Norman Boker. There was no blood. Smiling, he kicked the boy's head, watched the flies scatter, and said, "It's like with that old TV show Paladin, have gun, will travel." Henry Dobbins thought about it. "Yeah, well," he finally said, "I don't see no moral." There it is, man. There it is. A true war story. That's the true war story. That little episode. That's a true war story. You can tell a true war story if it embarrasses you. If you don't care for obscenity, then you don't care for the truth. If you don't care for the truth, watch how you vote. Send guys to war. They come home talking dirty. Which is why when I read this in class with kids, 11th graders, not little kids, but when I read this in class with kids, I always say all the words. And at first, it's very embarrassing for them. But you can't look away. You can't look away. And Rat says, "I write this beautiful letter. I slave over it, and what happens, she never writes back." And there's a lot of unpretty language in there that I'm not reading out loud because this is YouTube, but it's in there. And if you're reading the stories with us, you know. So he's written this letter home, and it's about his friend who's died. It's not about Ted Lavender. It's about Kurt Lemon. We haven't met Kurt Lemon yet. It's about Kurt Lemon. And what happened was we crossed a muddy river. Please remember rivers. If you're reading along with me this year, mark all the rivers. We crossed a muddy river and we marched west into the mountains. And on the third day, we took a break along a trail junction in a deep jungle. And right away, Lemon and Rat Kiley started goofing and they didn't understand about the spookiness. They were kids. They just didn't know. A nature hike, they thought, not even a war. So they went off into the shade of some giant trees, quadruple canopy, no sunlight at all. And they were giggling and calling each other, playing a silly game they invented. The game involved smoke grenades, which were harmless unless you did stupid things. And what they did was pull out the pin and stand a few feet apart and play catch under the shade of those huge trees. And if nobody chickened out, the grenade would make a light popping sound. And they'd be covered with smoke, and they'd laugh, and they'd dance around, and then they'd do it again. It's all exactly true. It happened to me nearly 20 years ago, and I still remember the trail junction and those giant trees and the soft dripping sound somewhere beyond the trees, and I remember the smell of the moss. And except for the laughter, things were quiet. At one point, I remember Mitchell Sanders turned and looked at me, not quite nodding, as if to warn me about something, and then after a while, he rolled up his yo-yo and he moved away. He doesn't stop the fun, but he moves away. We're going to come back to this. We're going to be so far away from this point when we come back to it that you're not going to remember that we're coming back to it, but I promise you we're going to come back to it. They were just goofing. There was a noise, I suppose, which must have been the detonator, so I glanced behind me and watched Lemon step up from the shade into the bright sunlight. His face was suddenly brown and shining, a handsome kid, really, sharp gray eyes, lean and narrow-waisted, and when he died, it was almost beautiful, the way the sunlight came around him and lifted him up and sucked him high into a tree full of moss and vines and white blossoms. So he steps on a landmine. We just saw a friend step on a landmine in Friends. In any war story, but especially a true one, it is difficult to separate what happened from what seemed to happen. It's never moral. Subpoint, it embarrasses you. And it's impossible to determine what happened from what seemed to happen. In many cases, a true war story cannot be believed. If you believe it, be skeptical. It's a question of credibility. Often the crazy stuff is true and the normal stuff isn't, because the normal stuff is necessary to make you believe the truly incredible craziness. It's never moral. It's embarrassing. You can't differentiate, or it's really hard to differentiate between what you think happened and what actually happened. It's unbelievable. And then it goes on to tell you one of my favorite parts in the entire book. I feel like I've read too much of it already, though. In other cases, you can't even tell a true war story. Sometimes it's just beyond telling. It's never moral. It's hard to distinguish what's real and what's not. It's unbelievable. And sometimes you can't even tell it. For example, I heard this one, for example, from Mitchell Sanders. It was near dusk, and we were sitting at my foxhole along a wide, muddy river. Have you noticed the rivers? I mean, have you? The muddy river. I remember how peaceful the twilight was. It was an occasion for a good story. I'm skimming lots of things. God's truth, Mitchell Sanders says, a 6-man patrol. We'll come back to the 6-man patrol, but a 6-man patrol goes up into the mountains on a basic listening post operation. The idea is to spend a week up there, just lie low and listen for enemy movement. They've got a radio. So if they hear anything suspicious, they're supposed to call in artillery or gunships, whatever it takes. Otherwise, they keep strict field discipline, absolute silence. They just listen. Sanders glanced to make sure I had the scenario. He was playing with his yo-yo, dancing it with short, tight strokes of the wrist. His face was blank in the dusk. We're talking regulation, by-the-book LPs. These 6 guys, they don't say boo for a solid week. They don't got tongues, all ears. We will be coming back to all of this later. Right, I said. Understand me? Invisible. Sanders nods. Affirm. Invisible. So what happens is these guys get themselves deep in the bush, all camouflaged up. They lie down and they wait, and that's all they do. Nothing else. They lie there for 7 straight days. They just listen. And man, I'll tell you, it's spooky. This is mountains. You don't know spooky till you've been there. Jungle, sort of. Except way up in the clouds. And there's always this fog like rain, except it's not raining. Everything's all wet and swirly and tangled up, and you can't see Jack, and you can't find your own... I can't read that part on YouTube. Like you don't even have a body. Super spooky. Serious spooky. You just go with the vapors. The fog sort of takes you in, and the sounds carry forever. You hear stuff nobody should ever hear. So after a couple of days, the guys start hearing this really soft, kind of whacked out music, weird echoes and stuff, like a radio or something, but it's not a radio. It's the strange music that comes right out of the rocks, far away sort of, but right up close to. They try to ignore it, but it's a listening post, right? So they listen. And every night they keep hearing this crazy concert, all kinds of chimes and xylophones. I mean, it's this wilderness. No way. It can't be real. But there it is, like the mountains are tuned in to Radio Hanoi. Naturally, they get nervous. One guy sticks juicy fruit in his ears. Another guy almost flips. Thing is, they can't report music. They can't get on the horn and call back to the base and say, hey, listen, we need some firepower. We got to blow this whole thing up. They can't do that. It wouldn't go down. So they lie there in the fog and they keep their mouths shut. And what makes it extra bad, is the poor dudes can't horse around like normal. They can't joke it away. They can't even talk to each other except maybe in whispers. I take you back. I won't take you actually back, but I take you back to the things they carried when after Ted Lavender is blown up by is shot by the sniper, Kiowa wants to do is talk it through. Talk about it. So here we have, they can't even talk about it. So they lie in the fog and they keep their mouths shut. And what makes it extra bad is they can't horse around, they can't joke it away, and they can't even talk to each other. Except maybe in whispers, all hush, hush. And that just revs up the willies. All they do is listen. And there was some, the next part, you won't believe. Does that make it a true war story? Probably not, I said. You won't. And you know why? Because it happened. Because every word is absolutely dead on true. He wanted me to feel the truth. These 6 guys, they're pretty fried by now. And one night they start hearing voices like at a cocktail party. That's what it sounds like. This big swank cocktail party somewhere out there in the fog, music and chit chat and stuff. It's crazy. I know, but they hear the champagne corks. They hear the actual martini glasses. Real hoity-toity, all very civilized, except this isn't civilization. This is Nam. Anyway, the guys try to be cool. They just lie there and they groove. But after a while, they start hearing, you won't believe this. They hear chamber music. They hear violins and cellos. They hear this terrific soprano. Then after a while, they hear opera and glee club and a boys choir and a barbershop quartet and all kinds of funky chanting and Buddha stuff. And the whole time in the background, there's still that cocktail party. All these different voices, not human voices, because it's the mountains. Follow me. The rock. It's talking, and the fog and the grass and the mongooses, everything talks. The trees talk politics, the monkeys talk religion, the whole country, Vietnam, the place talks. It talks. Nam, it talks. The guys can't cope. They lose it. They get on the radio and they report enemy movement. A whole army, they say. They order up firepower. They get artillery. And gunships, they call in airstrikes, and I'll tell you, they crash that cocktail party. All night long, they just smoke those mountains. They make jungle juice. They blow away trees and glee clubs and whatever else there is to blow away. Scorch time. They walk napalm up and down the ridges. They bring in the Cobras, the F4s. They use incendiaries. It's all fire. And they make those mountains burn. Around dawn, things finally get quiet, like you never even heard quiet before. One of those real thick, real misty days, just clouds and fog. They're off on this special zone and the mountains are absolutely dead flat silent, like Brigadoon, pure vapor, everything's all sucked up inside the fog, not a single sound, except they still hear it. So they pack up and they start humping. Remember, humping means to hike, carrying all your gear. And they head down the mountain back to base camp. And when they get there, they don't say diddly, they don't talk, not a word, like they're deaf and dumb. Later on, this fatbird colonel comes up and asks what happened out there, what'd they hear, why all the ordnance, and the man's ragged out and he gets down tight on their case. I mean, they spent $6 trillion on firepower, and this colonel wants answers. He wants to know what the story is. But the guys don't say zip. They just look at him for a while, sort of funny-like, sort of amazed, and the whole war is right there in that stare. It says everything you can't ever say. It says, man, you got wax in your ears. It says, you'll never know. Wrong frequency. You don't even want to hear this. Then they salute him and they walk away because certain stories you don't ever tell. You can tell a true war story by the way it never ends. You can tell a true war story because there is no moral. It's hard to separate what happened from what really happened. Sometimes you can't even tell it, and it never seems to end. Not then, not ever, not when Mitchell Sanders stood up and moved off into the dark. It all happened. So then we hear another story, which we'll come back to later. We'll read it in a different video. It comes down to gut instinct. A true war story, if truly told, makes the stomach believe. I take you back to that description, that definition of war on pages 32 and 33. The war was nakedly and aggressively boring, the kind of boredom that caused stomach disorders, dripping inside you like a leaky faucet, a sort of acid. You'd try to relax, then you'd hear gunfire, you'd squeal. That kind of boredom. Gut instinct. It makes your stomach believe. Lots of stuff we'll come back to in here. So much stuff we'll come back to. I feel like I've read too much already, but there's so much stuff we'll come back to. Looking at the bottom of page 76, it says war is hell, but that's not the half of it, because war is also mystery and terror and adventure and courage and discovery and holiness and pity and despair and longing and love. War is nasty. War is fun. War is thrilling. War is drudgery. War makes you a man. War makes you dead. The truths are contradictory. War is also beauty, and a true war story will tell the truth about this, though the truth is ugly. It's beautiful and it's ugly, all at the same time. And in a war, you lose your sense of the definite, hence your sense of truth itself, and therefore it's safe to say that in a true war story, nothing is ever absolutely true. Often a true war story doesn't even have a point. You can tell a true war story by the questions you ask. Somebody tells a story, let's say, and afterward you ask, is it true? And if the answer matters, you've got your answer. So if the answer matters, it's not true. A true war story does not depend on that kind of truth. And here is a quote that has changed the way I read everything forever. A thing may happen and be a total lie, and another thing may not happen and be truer than the truth. 4 guys go down a trail. A grenade sails out. One guy jumps on it and takes the blast, but it's a killer grenade and everybody dies anyway. Before they die, though, one of the dead guys says, "What'd you do that for?" And the jumper says, "Story of my life, man." And the other guy starts to smile, but he's dead. That's a true story. That's a true story that never happened. In this chapter, there is a very intensely awful story that must be read, but read with caution. And it's one that you can't look away from. I can't look away from it. And also you have to remember it's about the killing of a baby buffalo, a baby water buffalo, by men who are killing men and being killed by men. And in it, this buffalo dies. We're going to have to come back to it, though, and we're going to have to come back to it in great intensity as our stories progress. I'm not going to look into it now, but know that as I read this next quote, he's talking about a story that he might sometimes tell about the killing of a baby water buffalo. We will return to the baby water buffalo many times, and I will read it in a future video, I'm sure, just for context's sake. But here it says, "Now and then when I tell this story, someone will come up to me afterwards and say she liked it. It's always a woman. Usually it's an older woman of kindly temperament and humane politics, and she'll explain that as a rule she hates war stories. She can't understand why people want to wallow in all the blood and the gore, but this one she liked. The poor baby buffalo, it made her sad. Sometimes even there are little tears. What I should do," she'll say, "is to put it all behind me and find new stories to tell." Page 33, we go back to, "My daughter Kathleen tells me it's an obsession that I should write about a little girl who finds $1 million and spends it all on a Shetland pony. In a way, I guess she's right. I should forget it, but the thing about remembering is that you don't forget. You take your material where you find it, which is your life at the intersection of past and present." Back to page 81. "What I should do," she'll say, "is to put it all behind me and find new stories to tell. I won't say it, but I'll think it. I'll picture Rat Kiley's face, his grief, and I'll think, you dumb fool." Because she wasn't listening. Remember, you're all ears. True war story sometimes, most times, can't even be told. You've got to listen. All ears. All ears. Ghosts, all ears. When you listen, you'll actually hear what's actually going on, and you won't believe it. When you really lay down to listen to what the pain and the experience and the individual has to say, you will be uncomfortable. It will not be clear what is fact and fiction. It will not make sense. There will be no moral. It may not have happened, but it will be truer than the truth. When you really listen, you will be made uncomfortable by what you hear. A glee club in the middle of Vietnam. She wasn't listening. All you can do is tell it one more time, patiently, adding and subtracting, making up a few things to get at the real truth. "No, Mitchell Sanders," you tell her. "No lemon, no Rat Kiley, no trail junction, no baby buffalo, no vines or moss or white blossoms. Beginning to end, you tell her it's all made up. Every detail, the mountains and the river, and especially the poor, dumb baby buffalo. None of it happened. None of it. And even if it did happen, it didn't happen in the mountains. It happened in this little village on the Ban Nang Peninsula, and it was raining like crazy. And one night, a guy named Stink Harris woke up screaming with a leech on his tongue. You can tell a true war story if you just keep on telling it. And in the end, of course, a true war story is never about war. It is about sunlight. It's about the special way the dawn spreads out on the river when you know you must cross the river and march into the mountains and do things that you are afraid to do. It's about love and memory. It's about sorrow. It's about sisters who never write back and people who never listen. And so the book gives the reader the challenge now, lays down the gauntlet. Have you been listening? Have these been true war stories thus far? And how are the stories from now forward going to change? Are they going to change? And I want you to really remember as we continue to read on, I said at the very start of this whole thing 2 videos ago, that every story in this book is the exact same story. You keep telling it. You keep telling it. You keep telling it. And when are we going to get to the truth? Enemies is the same story as Friends is the same story as The Things That They Carried is the same story as Spin is the same story as How to Tell a True War Story. They're all the same story. And all you can do is keep telling it, adding and subtracting things until somebody actually listens. In April, we are going to read The Dentist and The Sweetheart of the Song Trabong. I will warn you, The Sweetheart of the Song Trabong is some crazy stuff. Is it a true war story? Until then, let's go read.